All right, let's trace the chaotic, precarious, and honestly, absolutely fascinating 400-year struggle that forged the United States. We often think of history as this smooth timeline of inevitable events, but the reality is much more turbulent. It's a story of collision, revolution, massive expansion, and profound internal division that still heavily shapes the country we live in today. We've got 5 monumental eras to cover today: the collision of worlds, revolution and a new nation, the push out west, a house divided, and finally, war and reconstruction. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Collision of Worlds.
So this era is where complex, long-standing Native American societies suddenly came face-to-face with European explorers who were aggressively seeking new trade routes and, well, unprecedented riches. It moved fast. Columbus arrives in 1492, then boom, the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown hits in 1607, and the Pilgrims land at Plymouth in 1620. But we have to look at the dark dual narrative here. The arrival of Europeans immediately brought devastating diseases that just swept through native populations. And absolutely crucially, 1619 marks the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia, brought over by English privateers. This was the grim beginning of 2.5 centuries of chattel slavery in what would eventually become the U.S. To really wrap your head around the deeply commercial mindset of early European settlement, consider this number. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company purchased the entire island of Manhattan from the local Munsee Lenape tribe for a mere $24. $24. It perfectly captures the nature of that time, you know. It was all about claiming massive amounts of land and resources at the absolute lowest cost possible. And there's a really stark cause and effect at play here. While European settlements and their trade economies boomed, this exact expansion directly catalyzed brutal existential conflicts. Take King Philip's War in 1675, for example. It was sparked by English encroachment on Wampanoag land, and it quickly became the bloodiest conflict in North America to date. It fundamentally decimated native communities in New England, and tragically set a pattern that would repeat for centuries.
Moving on to Section 2. Revolution and a New Nation.
Fast forward a century, and the wealthy British colonies had basically reached a breaking point, and ironically, it was over war debt. The British had just won the massive French and Indian War, but they were deeply in debt. So to pay it off, Parliament levied new taxes on the colonies, things like the Stamp and Sugar Acts. Well, the colonists, who had zero representation in Parliament, violently protested. This escalated all the way to the Sons of Liberty dumping highly taxed tea into Boston Harbor. You know, the famous Boston Tea Party. In response, Britain brought down the hammer with a crushing, intolerable axe, pushing the colonies right to the brink of rebellion. But then, the conflict transformed dramatically. What started as a rebellion over taxes shifted into a full-fledged revolution for human rights when the Continental Congress adopted Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in 1776. Look at these words. They completely redefined the stakes. They weren't just fighting for their wallets anymore. They were officially fighting to birth a new, sovereign nation based on the radical, unprecedented idea that all men are created equal. So after the mysterious shot heard round the world at Lexington in 1775, General George Washington led a really beleaguered Continental Army against literally the greatest empire on earth. And against all odds, aided by the French, they achieved an impossible military victory, forcing the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. But actually, right after winning, the new nation faced a massive political and economic disaster. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation, which was a system so weak that the federal government couldn't even collect taxes or settle disputes between states. To save the fledgling nation from just totally collapsing into anarchy, leaders convened in 1787 to draft a completely new constitution. But man, this sparked a fierce ideological divide that, let's be honest, we still hear echoing today. You had the Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, arguing for a strong central government to maintain order and a unified economy. On the flip side, the Anti-Federalists feared tyranny and demanded strong state power to protect individual liberties. Through some really intense compromise, the Constitution was finally ratified, establishing the modern system of checks and balances we use today.
All right, Section 3. The Push Out West.
Once the government stabilized, the early 1800s saw this breathtaking, rapid territorial expansion. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson essentially doubled the size of the country overnight with the Louisiana Purchase. Then, the U.S. survived a second major conflict with Britain in the War of 1812, which really firmly legitimized the nation on the global stage. And by 1848, the discovery of gold in California was pulling hundreds of thousands of settlers all the way out to the Pacific coast.
Before we look at the cost of all that expansion, I have to highlight a really wild anecdote from the War of 1812. The U.S. was actually invaded, and British troops literally burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. I'm talking the Capitol, the White House, everything. But right in the middle of the chaos, First Lady Dolly Madison, alongside an enslaved servant named Paul Jennings, just refused to leave without securing the famous Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. Micro moments of intense resilience like this under literal fire became legendary, and they really cemented the young nation's stubborn refusal to quit.
And that stubborn drive crystallized into a massive ideology known as Manifest Destiny. It was this absolute, almost quasi-religious belief that the United States was unquestionably destined to stretch from sea to shining sea. This powerful idea was used to justify aggressive expansion, including the highly controversial annexation of Texas and the subsequent Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which ended up stripping Mexico of half its territory and securing places like California and New Mexico for the U.S.
But we absolutely have to confront the devastating human toll of Manifest Destiny. This relentlessly tragic push west resulted in the deaths of roughly 15,000 Native Americans. Driven by policies like President Andrew Jackson's 1830 Indian Removal Act, tens of thousands of indigenous people from tribes like the Cherokee and Seminole were violently forced off their ancestral lands. Their grueling, deadly forced march across the country became known, terribly, as the Trail of Tears. Which brings us to Section 4, A House Divided.
As the map of the United States grew larger, so did the deepest, darkest fracture in the American soul. Every single time a new piece of Western territory was added to the country, a bitter debate erupted in Congress. Would it be a free state or a slave state? The nation was completely split, geographically and economically. The northern states leaned heavily toward abolition and an industrial economy, while the southern states were deeply entrenched in an agrarian economy that was entirely dependent on the brutal institution of chattel slavery. So the fragile balance of political power was constantly teetering on a knife's edge.
Politicians desperately tried to patch the country together with legislation like the Missouri Compromise. But, as we see here, every compromise ultimately failed. This failure directly led to literal guerrilla warfare in the territories, an incredibly violent era known as Bleeding Kansas, and radical actions like abolitionist John Brown's armed raid on Harper's Ferry. The breaking point finally arrived in 1860. The very moment anti-slavery Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Southern states began seceding from the Union.
And that boiling point erupted in April 1861 at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Confederate forces opened fire on the federal fort. But what's truly incredible about this event is that despite a relentless 34-hour artillery bombardment, 0 Union soldiers were killed in the action. None. The Union forces surrendered the fort and marched out. But even though the casualty count that day was miraculously 0, those shots officially ignited the horrific inferno of the American Civil War.
Our final era, Section 5, War and Reconstruction.
To really grasp the sheer, catastrophic scale of this tragedy, you just have to look at the numbers. Over 4 years of brutal, total war between the Union and the Confederacy, roughly 600,000 American lives were lost. Let that sink in. Whole regions of the South were burned and completely decimated. To this day, it remains the deadliest military conflict in American history.
The tide of this massive war shifted decisively in 1862 when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a total game changer. It definitively shifted the North's explicit war goal from simply reuniting the country to abolishing slavery entirely. Following really decisive Union victories at places like Gettysburg and Vicksburg, General William Tecumseh Sherman carved a massive path of destruction through the South. Finally, trapped and entirely out of resources, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in the spring of 1865.
But just days after that monumental victory, President Lincoln was tragically assassinated. So the deeply controversial task of physically and politically rebuilding the nation, which we call Reconstruction, fell to a really fractured government. Yet in those immediate post-war years, Congress actually managed to pass 3 transformative constitutional amendments. Step 1, the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. Step 2, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection. And Step 3, the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights for black men. The federal government even deployed troops to the South just to enforce these new laws.
But, this progress was incredibly fragile. To settle a disputed presidential election in 1877, a political compromise was struck. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. The government essentially abandoned its efforts to protect these newly won civil rights, which gave rise to a century of systemic oppression, violence, and segregation known as Jim Crow. So, as we look back, we really have to ask ourselves, when the dust finally settled on the 19th century, did the United States truly heal the darkest fracture in its soul, or did it simply delay the struggle? It's a heavy question, but it's one that continues to shape the American story today.